Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session, Elections Matter, Protecting the Right to Vote Across the Country. My name is Michele Crosby, and I'm the Director of Foundation Relations at Equal Justice Works. We're so grateful that you are able to join us for this panel. If you would like to enable closed captioning, you can do so by selecting the closed captioning option at the bottom of your screen. Also, if you have any questions or comments for our panelists during the session, you can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and our panelists will do their best to answer as many questions as they can toward the end of the session. As a reminder, this panel will run from 3 o'clock to 4 o'clock Eastern Time. This session will be recorded, and a recording link will be available tomorrow morning on the Grad Leaders platform. So without further ado, I'm pleased to hand it over to our moderator, Ari Savitzky.
Thanks so much, Michele. Thanks for hosting us here today to Equal Justice Works. I'm delighted to be here to talk with Jonathan and Rebekah and Patrick about voting rights issues and our work in that space. I'm a senior staff attorney at the ACLU in the Voting Rights Project. And I think first some introductions are in order, and I'd love to hear more from each of the panelists about who you are, where you work, what your role is, and sort of what you do, what your work is all about. So I can call on Rebekah to go first if that's all right, or folks can volunteer.
Thanks. I'm Rebekah Caruthers. I am Vice President at the Fair Election Center. I just want to give a quick shout out to EJW. In 2007, after law school, I was an AmeriCorps EJW Fellow, and I served on the Gulf Coast through the Louisiana Bar Foundation doing some post-Katrina and post Hurricane Rita work. And so I'm very excited to be able to be in front of you all today. So at the Fair Election Center, we do 4 distinctive areas of work. We do youth voter engagement through our Campus Vote project. So we do a lot of campus organizing on over 280 college campuses across the country. We have a litigation team where we are doing a lot of litigation across the country now. I think we're getting ready to announce another filing in the next week or two. And so I promised our litigators that I will not spill the beans on the upcoming filing. We also do advocacy mainly on the federal level. And finally, we have something called workelections.org, where we recruit poll workers. And currently we've recruited over 125,000 poll workers for this election cycle. We work with Power the Polls, which we co-founded a few years ago.
I'm happy to go next. My name is Jonathan Diaz. I am Senior Legal Counsel for Voting Rights at Campaign Legal Center in Washington, D.C. We are a democracy reform organization. We work across 4 main issue areas: campaign finance, government ethics, voting rights, and redistricting. In my role on the voting rights team, I split my time between our voting rights litigation, which mainly focuses on access to the ballot, issues involving in-person voting, vote by mail, voter registration, things like that. And our policy work, which we do on the federal, state, and local level, pushing for legislative change and policies that increase access to the ballot and make democracy more transparent and inclusive and accessible. Some of our main areas of focus lately have been our Restore Your Vote project, which focuses on felony disenfranchisement and rights restoration for people who've had contacts with the criminal system. We operate restoreyourvote.org, which is sort of a one-stop web tool for people to figure out if they are eligible to vote despite a past felony conviction. And we've also been working with a number of other organizations, including the Brennan Center, on combating election sabotage and an increased focus on the post-voting aspects of the electoral process and making sure that the canvassing and certification of elections goes off the way that it's supposed to.
And hi, everyone. My name is Patrick Berry, and I'm an attorney at the Brennan Center for Justice. The Brennan Center for Justice is a nonpartisan law and policy institute affiliated with NYU Law. At the Brennan Center, I am in the Voting Rights and Elections program, as well as the Judiciary program. In terms of the work of the voting team, we advocate for pro-voter laws at the state and federal level. We also fight back against restrictive voting laws in state and federal court. We are also a think tank and a communications hub. And we've done a ton of work with the organizations that my panelists are at. And so I'm very happy to be joining you all today.
Thank you all so much for those introductions. I was thinking in terms of the sort of format of the discussion, we could talk in a little more detail about the work that you're doing. And we could then maybe zoom out and talk a little bit, if there's time, about the substantive issues that we're seeing with the 2022 election, and what we're seeing there, the voting rights issues that are coming up right now as we get towards November, and then go back to you personally and talk about sort of how you got to where you are, your path, from law school to where you are, and then maybe a little bit about what current law students who are thinking about working in voting rights and civil rights and democracy should be thinking about. So if that works, let's talk a little bit more about your work and what it is you do as a voting rights lawyer. I know you started to talk about what your organizations do, but can you talk a little more about sort of a project that you're working on right now that's taken up a lot of your time? If you can, I know, Rebekah, there may be some that you can't talk about, but something you're working on that's taking up a lot of your time, and if it relates to it, how it relates to the 2022 election coming up.
Sure, I'm happy to start. So like I said, I spend about half of my time on litigation. And so currently, I'm spending a lot of time litigating cases that we filed in the aftermath of either the 2021 or 2022 legislative sessions. So I'm working on a case in Georgia right now, one of the many cases challenging Georgia's Senate Bill 202. Our case is narrowly focused on absentee ballot application distribution and some of the limitations that law places on civic engagement organizations and their ability to distribute absentee ballot applications. So we're deep in discovery on that case, taking lots of depositions and exchanging a lot of discovery requests with our opposing counsel. And then I'm working on another case in Arizona challenging their House Bill 2492 and its documentary proof of citizenship and documentary proof of residency requirements, which I know Fair Election Center is also working on. And so in that case, we just got a motion to dismiss from the state. And so we are coordinating with the other plaintiff groups to figure out how to respond to that. In my non-litigation portfolio, and really focused on preparing for the 2022 midterms, as far as preparing for potential attempts at election subversion or election sabotage. It's a lot of working with community partners and grassroots groups to know what to look out for and how to prepare to be involved in things like canvassing boards and how to monitor certifications, and really providing election officials with as many resources and as much research and information as possible, so that they know how to respond in the event that things go sideways and they have a crisis that they need to respond to. So like any election year, it's a busy time. It seems like there's a new thing popping up every few minutes, but I think, speaking for myself, but maybe also for the other panelists, I think that's one of the reasons why I do this kind of work is that it's always very exciting. There's always lots going on.
Especially as November approaches.
Yeah.
Patrick, Rebekah.
Do you want to go ahead, Rebekah? Okay, so I'm happy to talk a bit about what I'm working on. So I'm doing a pretty wide variety of things in a number of different states, and that ranges from litigation to providing research and writing support for in-state partners, and then also doing some advocacy with local election officials. So in terms of litigation, right now I am working on a lawsuit in Texas challenging a law that was enacted by the legislature last year called SB1 that imposes a number of new restrictions on voting, including a very confusing voter ID requirement for applying for a mail ballot. And there are a number of organizations involved in that lawsuit, including the ACLU. And when we filed, we had hoped that we would have a final ruling before the November election. But unfortunately, our trial was pushed back to next July because of a variety of reasons, including the fact that many of the parties that are involved in our lawsuit are also involved in the big redistricting litigation that's going on right now in Texas. There are also a number of discovery disputes in our case. So unfortunately, we're not going to have relief before the November election, but there are a ton of groups in Texas who are doing really great work to do voter education on the ground to make sure that everyone understands the new rules that are in place. So in addition to that, we are also, I mentioned, providing just research and writing support where needed in a number of states on a wide variety of issues like voter intimidation or door-to-door canvassing. And one issue that I'm working on that is taking up a lot of my time is in Florida recently, over 30 people with past felony convictions have been arrested for voting, for registering to vote or voting while allegedly ineligible in the 2020 election. And many of the people who have been charged were led to believe by a government official or election official that they could vote. Some also received a voter information card in the mail, which they took as a sign that they were eligible to vote. And these prosecutions stem from confusion of the state of Florida's own making, because in 2019, after Florida voters approved a constitutional amendment called Amendment 4 that restored the right to vote to most people with past felony conviction, the legislature passed a law that, among other things, required people to pay certain types of legal financial obligations, so fines, fees, restitution. And that law has just introduced a significant amount of confusion in Florida among not just individuals with past convictions, but also election officials in the state itself. And so, and one of those reasons is because no one, including the state of Florida, tracks legal financial obligations. So it's difficult to know, what people owe, what payments they've made. And so some of the work that we're doing there is we put together a guide working with the ACLU National, ACLU Florida, and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund for attorneys and advocacy groups that are that want to help people with past convictions figure out whether or not they're eligible. And I would note that that guidance is 25 pages, and it's not exhaustive. It's meant to be used as a starting point. So that just demonstrates just how confusing it is in Florida. And then lastly, also related to rights restoration, but in New York, I'm doing some outreach to individual county boards of elections because their websites incorrectly say that people on parole can't vote. And that hasn't been true in New York since 2018. And so we're trying to, do what we can to make sure that they update their websites in a timely fashion.
So I'll answer this question twofold. I'll talk about some of the litigation that we've done recently, and then talk more about my day-to-day work, because my day-to-day work looks a little bit different than both Patrick and Jonathan. So specifically with some of the litigation that we're doing, Jonathan, we're not in Texas. Texas is one of those states we're just not in the middle right now. Earlier this year in Florida, we had a third-party voter registration case that we took, where we sued on behalf of the Harriet Tubman freedom fighters. Our argument was that Florida's law was unconstitutional, with a disclaimer that third-party voter registrations would have to use in order for them to register people. So basically, it was a law that said that you have to have this really scary disclaimer saying, hey, even if we register you to vote, there's a great chance that we won't turn it in on time, or we will intentionally not turn it in on time. So that's unconstitutional, because it creates a chilling effect. And so Harriet Tubman Freedom Fighters is the organization that does organizing within Black communities in Florida. In Wisconsin, we spent a lot of time, our senior counsel and director of litigation, John Sherman, has spent a lot of time with some of the voter purge cases coming out of Wisconsin. They just like to disappear folks who appear on in the voter files and say that they are no longer, eligible to vote. We also have had cases in Arizona as well, similar to what Jonathan was talking about, like with some of the new show your paper laws. We have issues with that. We had a case a few years ago in Louisiana of where there was Vietnamese Americans, some more recent immigrants, who were told that if they didn't show their naturalization into the United States, they wouldn't be able to register to vote. And so we were able to put pressure in Louisiana to repeal a 200-year-old law, which was basically put on the books. I mean, as you can imagine, racism, but specifically to keep Caribbean immigrants from coming into Louisiana and after obtaining citizenship, registering to vote. We've also done felon restoration of rights with Kentucky and Tennessee, of making sure that those who are now eligible to be able to vote are able to vote. What's really interesting here is that this isn't necessarily a Democrat issue. It's not a Republican issue, because sometimes when you have a Democratic governor, you also have these same issues as well. I just want to point that out, that, our perspective is that the right to vote, people, regardless of political party, affiliation, race, orientation, people should be able to vote. If they want to vote, if they're eligible to vote, they should be able to vote. So specifically talking about what I do on a day-to-day basis, since I am the vice president at Fair Election Center, as you can imagine, that means I do a lot of fundraising and development with donors to make sure that we're able to fund all this great work that we're doing. Spend time with thinking through where we want to go as an organization. I mentioned that we do a lot of youth engagement work on college campuses. We're in over 41 states. Recently, we've lifted up a HBCU program, Historically Black Colleges and University program, of making sure that students on those campuses aren't facing additional barriers to accessing the ballot. Well, we found that HBCUs, so those particular students, face additional barriers that students at PWIs, predominantly white institutions, don't face when it comes to vote. So for instance, Southern University, which is in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, we sat down with some folks there. They had to fight the state of Louisiana to allow their students to use their their campus address to register to vote. And the state of Louisiana tried to say that the official campus address wasn't recognized in the state of Louisiana, even though this official address was recognized for other purposes, to do state business with the state of Louisiana. And so we've noticed with other HBCUs, whether it's been on the redistricting side, like usually those are the schools that are divided for purposes of redistricting. We noticed that when it comes to different voter ID issues, Like for instance, some of the work that we're doing in Texas on the organizing side, when I think of Waller County, where Prairie View is, which is a HBCU, where Prairie View students had to fight to be able to use, fight one to make sure that they actually were able to maintain their polling location on campus, but also fight when it comes to whether or not that they could use their college IDs as an appropriate ID in order to register to vote. So with our campus program and spending a lot of time with administrators across the country, we're starting to learn more of the issues that are impacting college students, young people, when they're trying to access the ballot box. So that's been a really interesting bit that I've been doing more in my day-to-day job, especially as we're starting to hear all sorts of crazy stories that I never imagined. Showed up to Grambling, sat down with some administrators, and on the civic engagement side with the work that we do, just listening to them, I'm finding out that in Grambling, last year they got their first grocery store, even though that university has been around for over 100 years, versus 5 miles down the street, there's Louisiana Tech University, which has 5 grocery stores near the campus. And so we've been using civic engagement as a way to get access to some of these campuses. But on our litigation side, we've been able to figure out useful ways for us to find niche cases that we could take on that also supports overall civic engagement, but then specifically supports access to the ballot box.
Thanks so much, Rebekah and Patrick and Jonathan. I just want to echo one thing that Rebekah said, which is that the work of voting rights and democracy is sort of fundamentally nonpartisan, right? It shouldn't be part of the right to vote, to fair representation, is sort of fundamental to what our system of government should be, and we should be celebrating democracy. And so I think there's something that's, it's an aspect of this work that that I think can't emphasize enough. And so I really appreciate that that comment. And it's a powerful statement when you're an advocate too, to say, to affirm, like, this is something we should all believe in. This is something we can all believe in. Just in listening to all of you, there's so many overlaps. Like literally, we're working on some of the same cases. Patrick, I see on the docket in the SB1 case, and Jonathan talked about a case they're working on with the Fair Election Center, and also at the same time, so many unique projects. And it emphasizes to me that there's just so much work to do. From the local level and working in communities, understand the specific needs of communities to the national level. I want to ask a little bit about your views of the terrain as we approach the election, the next election. We've seen major conflicts, local, state, federal, over efforts to make it easier to vote or more difficult to vote in some states, some of which you all talked about, fights over mail ballot voting, absentee voting, some of which emerged out of the pandemic, fights over redistricting, and many other battles, both in advocacy and litigation spaces. How do you see all of this sort of shaking out as we go to the 2022 election, and sort of what is the state of play for a voter who's starting to think about actually going to cast a ballot? Early voting is meant to start in some places. Don't all speak at once.
I'm happy to go first. So you're right, and we've all hinted at this. There are just a lot of fires right now, and that's even after months of a lot of hard work at our organizations and our peer national organizations and in-state partners. But one thing that has definitely shaped the terrain is restrictive voting legislation. So at the Brennan Center, we've tracked legislation related to voting for, I think, either a decade or over a decade. But this year, what we've seen is dozens of states have enacted new restrictive laws that touch on all aspects of voting. So how people vote, where people vote, and when people can cast a ballot. And these laws, unfortunately, are largely motivated by lies about the 2020 presidential election being stolen. They're also, racial backlash to the historic turnout that we saw in the presidential election. And then, one other issue is just the federal courts right now are especially unfriendly to, voting rights cases. And so, at the Brennan Center, and I'm sure the same is true for my co-panelists, we've had to, do some reorient our thinking in terms of, the tools that are most effective for pushing back against these various restrictions.
Yeah, 100% co-sign everything that Patrick said. And I'll just add that everything that Patrick described is also happening against the backdrop of this most recent redistricting cycle, which in many states is ongoing. There is still litigation happening all over the country over not just congressional maps, but state legislative maps for state houses and state senates, and local electoral maps, school boards and city councils and things like that. This redistricting cycle, I think, was characterized by a real kind of whiplash in terms of judicial decisions, where we saw some, I think, really strong pro-voter decisions being made by even conservative courts, being snatched away by appellate decisions and stays in some cases, and by legislative and executive refusal to comply with judicial decisions in other cases. I don't know how many times the Ohio Supreme Court has to say that their congressional map is unconstitutional before they get to one that isn't. But it's that legislature's kind of refusal to go along with their Supreme Court. That's everything that's happening in Ohio now in November is happening under these maps that have been declared unconstitutional. Likewise in Alabama and Louisiana. And so I completely echo what Patrick said about the federal courts being a real obstacle towards progress in terms of voting access. And the specter of the Supreme Court, I think, is looming large over this fall's elections as they prepare to hear argument in the Milligan case, which could determine the fate of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, and the Moore versus Harper case on the so-called independent state legislature theory. So I think that at least at CLC, and I know the same is true for many of our national partners and our state and local partners, we're having to be more creative as far as how we tackle these problems, thinking about administrative advocacy and state and local policy change, while continuing to push for federal law changes. But federal lawsuits, I think, are an increasingly uphill battle in some cases.
I wholeheartedly agree with both Patrick and Jonathan. We're seeing some of the same things on the legal side. Definitely being concerned about subversion, with this upcoming election. Even with some of the work that we do in Georgia on more of the policy and then the organizing side, with some of the college campuses that we work with, thinking about Fulton County and some of the early voting sites being removed. And we just did some research to actually understand. So on our organizing side, we did some research recently with HIT Strategies, just to figure out what are young people's attitudes towards voting. Because with all of the voter suppression that we've seen, with all of, I won't say negative information, but unfortunately we don't have the most positive information with the landscape right now. We really wanted to understand how is that impacting college students? Does this make them less likely to want to turn out and vote? And one of the things that we saw, we did a series of polling, but we also sat down with them and did different focus groups. And the number one thing was they weren't sure that it mattered even if they did vote. Because of everything that they're hearing in the media, but also the things that they've seen passed legislatively. They're just not sure. And so we're thinking through the types of messaging and targeted messaging that we need to do to be able to change the tide. And using even Georgia 2020 as an example of that, when young people actually turned out in record-breaking numbers, that there was a change from the status quo. And so we're trying to use that to get young people engaged and still want to be engaged in democracy. So at Fair Election Center, we have a real fear about democracy engagement. And so like earlier when I used kind of like extraneous example about grocery stores, we really want young people to understand, like if you want to change your community, if you want to change what's happening on your campus, your town, and your neighborhoods, you have to understand that voting is one of many steps within civic engagement. And we've been trying to broaden how they view that as a way to keep them encouraged to make sure that they are showing up to vote this fall.
Thanks so much. And it is that there's so many uphill fights, but I also, I want to get to the sort of how did you get here and what would you say to law students, but I also want to pick up something I heard in I think what each of you said, and Jonathan, you mentioned this a little more explicitly, but where do you see, if at all, in this environment, potential to expand voting rights, to create sort of positive change? How would you assess the possibility for creating change in Congress and the states and other actors, and sort of how can we shift the tide, as it were, if you think that's possible?
Yeah, I mean, I won't say that I think it will be easy, because it certainly won't. But I think that there still really are a lot of opportunities to make positive change, especially at the state and local level. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit. There are a lot of administrative or policy changes that local election administrators or election officials are open to, but maybe don't have the time or the resources to be able to implement, or the know-how. And so I think that community organizing and support from legal groups like ours can really help to fill a lot of those gaps, and to provide election officials and community leaders with the tools to make some of those changes happen at the margins. As far as a big federal voting bill, or federal court decisions, the odds aren't great, but they're not zero. When the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis bill, didn't get through the Senate, was that earlier this year? Was that last year? I don't know. It's in the pandemic time stream. It was disappointing, yes, but I, reminded myself that the Voting Rights Act didn't just spring into being in 1965, in one day. And that, in the 1950s, it must have looked way more bleak than it looks now, for a whole host of different reasons. But we got to the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and the real advances in democracy in the 60s because of sustained local organizing, and because of, partnerships between national civil rights groups and regular everyday community members. And I think that's the only way that we are gonna make any progress right now.
Do you want to go ahead, Rebekah?
Either way, that's fine.
Sorry, I keep cutting you off. I apologize. I promise it won't happen again. But I agree with what Jonathan said. I definitely think there's a ton of potential at the state and local level. So in New York, Governor Hochul recently signed the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act of New York, which is the strongest protections for voters against discrimination. And then also in Michigan this year, there's a ballot measure that will expand access to voting in the state. And so I definitely think that these wins at the state and local level help move the needle at the federal level.
Sure. I was going to say that there's still work that can be done and measurable success at the margins, even thinking through administrative fixes, just to make sure that those with disabilities are able to access the ballot and, you know, figure out ways to make it less onerous. So I would say, like, at Fair Election Center, you know, we're not as large as some of the other shops, and that's okay. But because of that, you know, we're small but mighty. We tend to really pick some of those cases at the margins, and understanding that this is a long struggle, like Jonathan said, that we're looking for ways to keep pushing the ball forward, knowing that we might, sorry if I'm using a football analogy here, I'm a Nebraska Husker, but even if we're only able to, I know, Jonathan, and it's awful, but I'm born and bred in Nebraska.
It's rough out there.
It is so sad. Even we pay people to beat us really bad at home. But even if we're only able to carry a couple yards here and there, we're still advancing the ball down the field. And so that's something important. And that's something that I would say, you know, speaking for myself, maybe for everyone, gives us hope, because we know that we're going to get there. We do know this is a fight that every generation is going to have to actively fight, but we do know that we are making progress when we look through decades of history.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you for lifting my spirits a bit today. I know we all of us always need that, and it's important to reinforce each other. I don't know how we're doing on time. I wonder whether I sort of had time for one more question before, in order to leave time for Q&A. If that's the case, and piggybacking on the idea that this is, you know, a struggle of many years that we're in to get to the next goal, what would you tell someone who's sort of beginning their journey, who's a law student, who wants to be a voting rights lawyer, or who's interested in public interest work more generally? What would you tell them about what classes to take, what kind of skills to develop, what kind of mentality to develop? What advice would you give?
I would say really work on your legal writing. I would say that is a good basis for this type of work. I'll also put a plug in. We have fall legal internships. We have spring internships, summer internships. We also have a post-law school fellowship that we offer as well. And so I would say, look at the many different organizations that are doing this type of work, try to get as much experience as possible. Try to get an internship, because when I'm reviewing resumes, or when we're going through our when we're going through the application process, we're looking for someone who has a real demonstrated interest in this area. So, like, for instance, if there is some type of competition around voting rights that you can do, if there's a journal where you can really talk about some of this work, just figure out different avenues and opportunities so you can show your demonstrated interest in this work.
Yeah, I would add that, any kind of clinic work at a law school, especially anything that gives you direct client service experience, is really, really valuable. One of the things that I think law schools are not great at teaching are, the kind of more mundane, soft skills of lawyering, especially public interest lawyering. Learning how to interview a client or a witness, how to how to get someone who doesn't understand legal concepts or claims or evidence to talk to you about, their experience in a way that both makes them feel comfortable and makes them, puts them in a place where they can share, what they're going through with you, but also gets you the facts and the information that you need to be able to build a complaint. And a lot of public interest lawyering, especially in the elections context, is not just about pleading your case to a judge, but pleading your case to the public. And so being any opportunity that you have to learn how to translate sometimes abstract legal concepts into a way that makes the public care about them, that connects things like the health of democracy to, the tangible impacts on people's everyday lives. You're not going to learn that writing an appellate brief for a law school class. So really any opportunity that you have to work on public speaking, on interacting with non-lawyers and regular people, I think is really, really valuable and something that is often kind of neglected in the law school education process.
What Jonathan just said really resonated with me because I feel like a lot of my time is spent trying to, take my writing and convey it in a way that's accessible for non-lawyers. And so being able to do that is a really great skill set to have. I would also echo what Rebekah said about applying to intern or extern at our organizations. One thing I would flag about the Brennan Center is we've recently started hiring entry-level staff attorneys as opposed to term-limited fellowships. And so that's one thing to keep an eye out for. I also agree with what Jonathan said in terms of clinics. Just speaking from my experience, when I was in law school, I participated in the legislative clinic, and it's proven to be incredibly helpful with the legislative advocacy that I've done at the Brennan Center in terms of drafting legislation and reading legislation and providing proposed amendments. Given the struggles I experienced with litigation, I also at times really wish I took a civil litigation clinic. And then the last thing is just not to hesitate to reach out to attorneys that are doing the work that you want to do. When I was in law school, I spoke to a number of voting rights attorneys at, NYCLU, the New York Civil Liberties Union, LDF, and they were incredibly helpful, very nice. Work with them now, but I would encourage you all to do that.
And if you want to be a civil rights litigator, and especially in federal court, just take Fed courts. I didn't. It is my greatest regret because I had to teach it to myself after law school. So if you can do it during law school, that is better.
The 1983 material alone is invaluable. Thank you all so much. And I mean, I'll just add to echo saying Patrick just said, I feel like I often when I'm talking to law students, say like, it can be hard, but ask for what you want. Go to that person who's senior and who's done the things you want to do and talk to them. It can be hard to put yourself out there when you're like a 2L or whatever, but do it. And people who have been doing this work want to help and want to talk to the next generation of lawyers, and they want to talk to you. So with that, let me pause and see if this is the appropriate moment to take questions, or if not, I have plenty more. But
This is the appropriate moment for questions. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box. Maybe Ari, while we're waiting for a question, you might want to talk about the issue you said you might want to address.
Sure. I mean, I think you mean issues that folks may address in their questions, or
I don't know, you said you might have another,
Oh, I have plenty of questions. I mean, one question I have is just what is an issue out there in the voting rights space and voting rights and democracy you think is not? I mean, there's so much attention on different issues, but there's also, you know, as we've discussed, there are things that are sort of under the radar. So what do you think is an issue that's sort of not getting enough attention? Maybe it will be getting attention, but you're sort of seeing it right now. Maybe it won't, and advocacy is part of focusing attention on it.
So I'm happy to share what I think. And so this is an issue that, you know, I believe all of our organizations work on in some capacity. But one issue that, you know, doesn't get a lot of attention from the media or lawmakers really is jail-based disenfranchisement. Many people who are in jail are eligible to vote because they haven't been convicted of a felony. But every election cycle, there are countless numbers of eligible voters who are barred from registering to vote or voting by mail because there's no infrastructure in place for them to do so. And because of the race and class discrimination in the criminal legal system, many of the individuals who are barred from voting are, you know, Black and brown or come from low-income communities. And fortunately, there's been quite a bit of progress in this space. So one thing that immediately comes to mind is in Cook County, Illinois, recently there was a law that required there to be a polling location to be inside the Cook County jail. And then also in the lead up to the 2020 election, because there was just so much attention on voting by mail because of the pandemic, we did start to see a lot more reporting about this issue. But that's one thing I think could use a little more attention, at least from the media and you know, non-voting rights attorneys.
Go ahead.
I was going to say the presidential election reform bill that we see that's moving. Very excited that that's happening. I know some folks have talked about that for years off and on, and sometimes people have scoffed at it and said, well, you know, there really isn't a need. And so I'm glad that Congress is actually looking to pass something. So fingers crossed that they actually pass this in the next month or so.
How cool would that be?
Yeah, Electoral Count Act reform has been needed since the Electoral Count Act passed, so it would be nice for them to get that over the finish line. You know, one issue that I personally have not done very much work on, but that I think is really under discussed, even within the voting rights community, is the issue of voting rights for residents of the U.S. territories, because they don't really have any. These are folks who, in many cases, including in Puerto Rico, are U.S. citizens who are wholly unrepresented in our federal government and yet subject to, you know, all the laws made by the federal government. And so, you know, the fact that not only do residents of Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands and American Samoa and Guam, you know, not only do they not have a vote for president, they have no representation, no voting representation in Congress. And, you know, much like the folks disenfranchised because of contacts with the criminal system, they are largely people of color. They are many of them are, you know, lower income than folks in the States. And, you know, we are playing so much defense in the voting rights and elections world right now, that I think that there's not really a lot of attention being paid to the places where we really need to be playing offense, to extend Rebekah's football metaphor. You know, the territories wholly lack representation, and I think that's something that we as a community could do a lot more on.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. Michele, how are we doing on questions?
We do have one question, and that question is, how do you stay motivated to do this work each day?
Who wants to start?
I mean, I still find it fun. I will also recognize that currently I'm not doing the traditional practice of law. So there are times I might have more of a rosier outlook than maybe Patrick and Jonathan. Because of that, I get to do a good mix of things. But also, so we do a lot of coalition building with the work that we do, and we get to interact with so many different communities across the country. And there's always a lot of hope, even though you're hearing like, yes, there is some gloom and doom right now, especially with some of the circuits, with some of these cases we'll have to run through. That's fine, but when we're interacting with these people who just want to be able to vote or just want to make sure that their voices are being heard, that's something you can't turn your back on. And so just like with anything else, yes, you try to find balance, but once again, we know that if we show up every single day, we're going to make things better. It may not be better by, going back to the analogy, we may not score each time that we have the ball, but we know that we're still moving forward and making progress.
Yeah, I think about the reasons why I wanted to do this work in the first place, which are very personal. My family comes from Cuba on both sides, both of my parents. And so all four of my grandparents came to the United States fleeing a repressive authoritarian government that they had no say in. And so they came here because of the promise of American democracy. And so I feel like I owe it to them, and the sacrifices that they made for me to be where I am, to make that promise more real for other people. And so, my commitment to democracy and my kind of passion for this work really draws from my family experience, and how, I know, not firsthand, but one generation removed, how fragile all of these things can be. And so that's what kind of keeps my fire going, to make sure that we protect and expand access to democracy as much as we can.
And I would just quickly add, so I definitely agree. I really enjoy the coalitional work. And I mean, I sit at a desk all day, but I get to interact with people who are, on the ground doing the, the nitty gritty. And I just am inspired by it, to be honest. And especially in the voting rights restoration space, where I do most of my voting work, but that movement is led by people who can't vote, or people who have family members who can't vote because of a past felony conviction. And when I think of in our Florida litigation related to the pay to vote requirement, we had one client who had never voted in his life, and he was in his 70s. And he was just so incredibly emotional when we got a favorable ruling that allowed him to vote. And he, took his grandson with him to, convey to, his family, to younger members of his family, how important it is to be civically engaged. And when I think about, who taught me the importance of voting and being civically engaged, it's your family members, it's your community. And so this is a really important fight. And also, all the people who I work with at the Brennan Center and at our peer organizations are just, incredibly smart, and I really enjoy working with them.
So those are all the questions we have. So I truly want to thank all our panelists for participating in this. It's been a great session. Thank you so much to everyone for participating today, and we hope you enjoyed it. We also want to thank our event sponsor, Idealist, for helping to make this year's Equal Justice Works Conference and Career Fair possible. If you have any questions about this year's event or want to know more about how Equal Justice Works can help you launch your public interest legal career, You can reach out to our event team at careerfair@equaljusticeworks.org. We hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.